So now that we talked about a lot of the important parts of avian conservation, like legislation, different scientific actions, and different tools that people use, we're now going to talk about some really interesting avian conservation stories. This is going to be fun, isn't it? The first one I want to talk about is a classic avian conservation story that a lot of people have already heard about, and that is that of the Peregrine Falcon. So the Peregrine Falcon story starts way back in 1940. The 1940s is when people started noticing this decline in peregrine falcon populations. Their populations declined all the way through the 1970s, and by the 1970s, their populations were completely gone from the eastern part of the United States, and their populations in the West had declined by up to 90%. So it was a really, really drastic, sharp decline of this species, and it wasn't caught early enough. Fortunately, when it was noticed in the 1970s that these populations depleted so much, action started to be taken. It was noticed that a lot of the cause of their declines was DDT. So you might have heard of DDT, because DDT is actually the compound that is attributed to the decline of the bald eagle species as well around that time. And DDT is a compound that is used in agriculture for pesticide usage. And what happens with DDT is something called bioaccumulation, where essentially the lowest of the food chain is exposed to the DDT, and as you move up that food chain, the exposure of those compounds increase by a certain level of magnitude. So by the time you get up to the apex predators, like the peregrine falcon or the bald eagle, the levels of DDT are that are so high that they have detrimental effects on their biology. And in the peregrine falcon and the bald eagle, a lot of the cause of decline for these species was that DDT was causing eggshell thinness. So what they were noticing was the shells on the eggs were so thin that the eggs were being crushed during natural incubation behaviors. The female would switch with the male, and then the eggs would crush. So that was causing a huge decline in the number of young that were being hatched into the population, which is a huge cause of why this species declined so much. So as a result of this decline, the Peregrine Fund was started, and the Peregrine Fund is still around today. And the Peregrine Fund dedicated itself to trying to recover these populations of peregrine falcons. And one important part of this was the fact that the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency noticed that the DDT was causing these effects and banned the usage of DDT in the United States. And it is still banned today because of the effects it was having on bird populations. So the Peregrine Fund, after DDT was banned, great, the cause has been fixed, but we still have these numbers that are so low. So the Peregrine Fund decided to start a captive breeding program where they put a ton of time and effort into breeding peregrine falcons in captivity to be released back into the wild. And a really interesting part about this is falconers had been breeding peregrine falcons and other falcon species in captivity for so long, so they knew exactly the techniques and how to be successful in this captive breeding. So falconers played a huge role in the recovery of the peregrine falcon species by working with the Peregrine Fund on figuring out the best way to captive breed these birds. And so once that captive breeding was success, they went to the eastern part of the United States and recovered those populations by releasing those captive breeding individuals. And they also helped to recover those populations on the West Coast as well. And fortunately, by 1999, the peregrine falcon was actually removed from the endangered species list. So that indicates that they had a great recovery, and it is due to the legislation of the government, the falconers' knowledge, as well as scientists and the resources of the Peregrine Fund that we can attribute to the recovery of this amazing falcon species.
So we just heard a little bit about the peregrine falcon and its recovery and the happy ending of its story. Now we're going to talk about a slightly different story, one that was still in the process This is Sol. He's a turkey vulture. Turkey vultures are fairly common throughout North America, especially throughout the United States. They're migratory. They move out of the northern parts of their range during the winter time, but can be seen quite commonly throughout the country in the summertime. Now, the reason I have him here with me today, he weighs about 3.5 pounds. His wingspan is maybe about 5 feet. He has a cousin here in the United States, though, known as the California Condor. The condor is a very special bird. It weighs closer to 20 pounds and has a wingspan of 9 feet. So much larger. In fact, I think I'd be pretty challenged to try to hold a California Condor like I'm holding Sol here. California Condor is special, though, for other reasons as well. They've been around since the Pleistocene era. Unfortunately, they almost went extinct. In the 80s, when I started working with birds, it was a great controversy because there were only 24 California condors left in the wild anywhere. And there was controversy was surrounding the California condor, whether they should be captured, those last 22 birds be brought into captivity and bred for future release and reintroduction into the wild. The reason it was so controversial is there was a concern. What if we take these birds out of the wild and we can't return them to their habitat? What if we can't preserve their habitat? What if we can't preserve California condor culture, as it were, and let these birds ever be wild again? Well, the story has a happy middle right now. There are over 500 California condors in existence, and many of them are in the wild. So it was a good bet to capture those 22 California condors, bring them into human care, to breed them, to raise their young, and release them back out into the wild. But the story is not over. Not only is 500 birds not really a sustainable number yet, but also the population itself is not sustainable. You see, California condors are still suffering one of their major problems, which is lead poisoning. Lead pellets, lead shot in their environment affects them tremendously, and many of them become sick and even have died from lead poisoning, which is why it's so important to not use lead shot, especially around areas where you might not be able to recover that shot, and it might get into the environment. Vultures, of course, including their cousins the condor, are carrion eaters. They feed on carcasses. So any dead animals that are left out in the wild with lead shot in them become a problem for scavengers like the turkey vulture and the California condor. Good news is people are keeping a close eye on the California condors. Oftentimes these birds have to be recaptured and treated for lead poisoning, but then can be released into the wild. And the efforts continue, the educational efforts to teach people why having lead in the environment is a problem, and also the efforts to raise these condors, release them, and to rid their environment of lead shot. So it's a good story, has a happy middle, and we hope eventually it will have a very happy ending as well.
So we've learned already about a couple of amazing conservation stories. The first being one that's largely at its completion, the story of the Peregrine Falcon, and another one that's still being written, and the story of the California Condor and vultures as a group as a whole. But the story of the American Kestrel and their conservation is only just beginning. These birds, unfortunately, in the wild have been in decline for about 40 to 50 years, but it's only been truly noticeable to scientists in the last 10 to 20. There's a lot of hypotheses as to what is going on with these birds and what is causing them to decline, and we're not fully sure. It is suspected that largely it is anthropomorphic effects, and that is people's and our development and our increase in population is causing their decline. The first hypothesis is habitat loss, which is a common story heard across lots of endangered species because they're disappearing because their home is disappearing. The other thing that it could be is effects from agriculture, specifically uses of pesticide. We've already seen with the Peregrine Falcon what that can cause. Now, the difference between the Peregrine Falcon, the California Condors, and the American Kestrel is we're catching this early. We're not treating the problem, we're helping to prevent it from happening in the first place. And a ton of research is being done into the life history of these birds as to see what's going on. American kestrels in the wild are cavity nesters, so they will nest naturally in the cavities of trees and other places like that made by other animals, but they will also use human-made nest boxes. So people across the country that have nest boxes that American kestrels are using, scientists can use the data year after year after year to study populations as they go up, and in their case, down. So citizen science is really important in a lot of conservation stories. And similar to the Peregrine Falcon story and the Peregrine Fund, another branch of the Peregrine Fund started when the research on American kestrels was started, and that's called the American Kestrel Partnership. Of course, if you want to learn more about American kestrels, their conservation, and be part of that story, we greatly encourage you to check out their website, their social media, and learn more about what scientists across the country are doing to help these fierce little birds. So another bird that we want to talk about with their conservation story is that of the Mexican spotted owl, which is a subspecies of the spotted owl known throughout kind of the southwestern United States. So these birds naturally in the wild nest and depend on old growth forests that are kind of mixed conifers. And scientists have noticed that these birds have been declining since probably about the 1990s. They suspect it's largely due, again, to those anthropomorphic effects, the largest one being habitat loss. Timber harvesting in their areas has been very heavy in the last few decades because those old growth forests are such strong trees used for building in a variety of different ways. So habitat loss, and from that you're also getting degradation of habitat, so it's not as good quality, and also fragmentation, where it's fragmenting into pieces that they're not comfortable moving across things like roadways, as well as just simple human development taking up their natural spaces. A problem as well in a lot of those old growth forests that scientists looked into was these catastrophic fires. So due to lack of fire or too much fire suppression in those areas, when wildfires happened, they were catastrophic to their environment. Now that's not as big of a problem for them, however, as being pushed out by other species. Because these birds depend on such a specific environment, if they're not in that, they don't do as well. So for instance, barred owls are a species of owl that is moving pretty swiftly east to west and is taking over naturally Mexican spotted owl habitat. Great horned owls as well are much larger and much more aggressive and are definitely known for pushing out spotted owls. Work, of course, is being done to help not only the Mexican subspecies, but the main one as well. In 2004, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services designated about 3 million acres of federal land in Arizona, Colorado, New Mexico, and Utah as critical habitat for these species. Unfortunately, they are still in decline, but just like with American kestrels, they are beginning their decline. So the more research we do right now and the more we work to conserve their natural spaces, the more of these animals that we will begin to see returning in the wild.
Thank you so much for joining us for the avian conservation portion of Celebration of Birds. We can't celebrate birds without appreciating the amount of conservation effort that has gone into preserving these species. If you're interested in supporting avian conservation, there's some great organizations that are leading the cause in avian conservation by combining both governmental efforts as well as scientific efforts. One of those I've mentioned a lot is the Audubon Society and the Peregrine Fund, both doing really great things. A few others that I have yet to mention are BirdLife International, American Bird Conservancy, and the Cornell Lab. So go check those out if you're interested in more information about avian conservation. And thank you so much for taking time to appreciate the efforts of everyone in avian conservation.